we're back with Outside the Book, and our guest now is Robert Morgan, a longtime faculty member since 1971 at Cornell University, and one of America's preeminent men of letters. He's a poet, he writes novels, he writes fiction and nonfiction. He has an incredible facility for the written word and the ability to communicate folks in a variety of literary styles. At this point in his career, he's done a lot of history, and that interests me in particular, so Robert, thank you very much for joining us here on Outside the Book.
Oh, it's very good to be here.
You have at least made a bit of a transition to become a historian in the latter part of your career. What's taken you in that direction with your books about Boone and about the Lions of the West, the folks who've kind of taken us on the westward movement?
Well, I've always been interested in history, so it's not a completely new thing for me. And I grew up on a farm, finding arrowheads and pieces of Indian pottery. My dad was a great fan of Daniel Boone, and the frontiersmen used to talk about it, so it's not a completely new thing. And in fact, I haven't given up fiction writing. I have a sequel to Gap Creek coming out next year. But I think as I got older, I became more and more interested in the history of this country, and particularly in the westward expansion, the frontier. I'm related to Daniel Boone distantly, though I think practically half the people in the country are related to Daniel Boone. And one thing led to another. The novel called Brave Enemies, which is set in the American Revolution, came out in 2003. I did a lot of research on the Revolutionary period in the South for that. That's what led me directly to writing about Daniel Boone and the Piedmont and mountain frontier in the 18th century and the Revolutionary period. I got so involved in studying Daniel Boone and the Indians of his time. I got to come to Kentucky at least a dozen times. Had a good excuse to keep coming back to the Blue Licks battlefield, to Boonesboro, to the Licking River where he had lived. And when I finished Boone, my publisher said, "What would you like to do next?" And I said, "Well, I would kind of like to follow the story of the westward expansion after Daniel Boone." So we talked about maybe a biography of David Crockett or Sam Houston, Kit Carson. But I remember saying to my publisher, of course, the great leader who was most interested in the westward expansion and most influential was probably Thomas Jefferson. And the person who actually negotiated the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1847-48, buying the West from Mexico, was Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas P. Trist. Yeah. Who for $15 million bought New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, half of Colorado, chunk of Wyoming. And my publisher said, "Oh, that's it. A story that begins with Jefferson and ends with his grandson-in-law."
How did you choose the 10 people that you've included in this book?
It was difficult because there's so many people I could have written about. There are more Indian leaders I could have written about, like Tecumseh, for instance. Thomas Hart Benton would have obviously been a very good figure to write about. But I decided I would write about figures for whom there was one particular event that defined their contribution to the westward expansion. In the case of Jefferson, it'd be buying Louisiana and sending Lewis and Clark up the Missouri all the way to the Pacific. For Andrew Jackson, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March of 1814, where he defeated the Creek Red Stick rebels and therefore opened Georgia and much of Alabama to settlement. Sam Houston, the Battle of San Jacinto. The odd figure in my book is Johnny Appleseed.
Well, yes.
Because here's somebody who's involved in the westward expansion who didn't kill Indians, didn't fight any battles, in fact was a missionary who was out planting seeds, apple trees, and spreading Swedenborgian theology, he thought. I just had to include Johnny Appleseed as the great exception. The center of the book is James K. Polk, who was the president who provoked war with Mexico and then forced Mexico to cede all that land of the West. There's a chapter on Winfield Scott, the great victor who conquered Mexico in 1847. Kit Carson, born here in Kentucky, grew up in Missouri, and is the greatest of the frontiersmen of the 19th century. Related to Daniel Boone. There was marriages between the Boones and the Carsons.
I guess one person who's not there that I'm intrigued by a bit, particularly given the Jefferson theme, is Meriwether Lewis. Why would you not include Lewis in this?
I decided not to include the Lewis and Clark expedition in detail because so much has been done on them recently that most readers interested in this period already know a lot about Lewis and Clark. So I concentrate on Jefferson's letter of commission to them and the long foreground of Jefferson's planning of that expedition, assuming that almost all my readers will have read one of the famous books, Stephen Ambrose's book, or seen the series on television, Ken Burns' series on Lewis and Clark. Yes, and I could have included a chapter on Boone as far as that goes. He's one of the great figures. But the book got so long, my publisher said, we've got to limit it to 10 people. We can't do any more.
As a historian, I continue to be intrigued, like a lot of folks are, with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, and the notion that the frontier defined the United States. Particularly as you've worked on this book, what do you see as the legacy of the westward expansion movement in the United States? Was Turner onto something, but he maybe could have expressed it differently? What would be your version of the frontier thesis?
Well, I think that Turner is essentially right, that the settlement of the wilderness and the West helped define the American character in ways that really could not be traced exactly back to Europe, that this was something different. It weren't just Europeans who happened to be in North America, but by the time of the westward expansion, there was a different culture, a different kind of personality. So I'm a great fan of Frederick Jackson Turner. His thesis doesn't explain everything, as many modern historians have pointed out. But he was right there in Wisconsin as a young man. He had the benefit of the Draper collection and the insights of Lyman Copeland Draper and this school of Wisconsin historiography. And I think to a great extent, he really is one of the finest American historians, and he recognized this thing that was different, that had to do with the aggressiveness on the one hand, the dreaming, the desire, the poetry of the West. And in some ways, he's never been surpassed, really. His breakthrough, I think about 1893, when he published the first essay, has defined an awful lot of American history since. Of course, every generation of historians feels that it has to be digging up some new material and some new insights, and there have been many new insights. But it would be hard to think of anything that surpasses the watershed that we associate with Jackson in the late 19th century.
Your 10 Lions of the West are pretty much political leaders, soldiers, men whose, with some exceptions, careers to a large extent have been touched by violence. Is the westward expansion a story of violence?
Oh, to a great extent it is. The killing of Indians and Hispanic people, clearing out indigenous people. It's by turns one of the most violent stories we know, and by turns one of the most admirable stories. The subtitle of the book is Heroes and Villains.
Yeah.
I've often been asked who are the heroes and who are the villains, and except for Johnny Appleseed, I think each of them is at times a hero and at times a villain.
I'm interested in the time frame you came up with this, because I think it's very creative, from Jefferson's birth to the gold rush. How did that, and that's pretty close to 100 years, how did that structure come to you as the context for the book?
It came to me gradually as I started out working on Jefferson, studying his letters of commission to George Rogers Clark, to Andre Michaud, then of course to Meriwether Lewis. And then I knew I was going to end with the Mexican War because that took the country to the Pacific. So that just fell into place organically. If you begin with Jefferson and then end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mm-hmm. The difficulty and the paradox of my book is that I believe the real work of westward expansion was done by the tens of thousands of nameless people, for the most part, who went to Texas, who went to Kentucky, who went into Tennessee and Arkansas, eventually to Oregon and to California. That's what really took the country to the west. It was the people who led and the generals and the government who followed, pretty much. And the Mexicans understood that. I spent a lot of time studying Mexican historians, and that's one of the things they point out, is that it was less the government of the United States than all these people who just kept plowing ahead into the territory and settling Texas, settling Arkansas, and then California. I mean, if you get more Americans in California than Mexicans, it's not that hard to take it over.
Robert, this is a fascinating story, and I appreciate the very special window you've given us on this uniquely American experience.
Well, I've enjoyed talking to you.
Our guest on this segment of Outside the Book is Robert Morgan, the author of Lions of the West.